We are back with you once again on another Johnnie Torch program. This time, Johnnie Torch's top 10 rules for writing. These are my top 10 writing rules that I gave on Twitter, and I figured why not make a video out of it, because I'm sure there's a lot of aspiring writers out there, others who want to become authors. Is that the same thing? I think it is. But I'm going to give a quick, hopefully a quick video, detailing my top 10 rules for writing. And of course, as the case with pretty much anything, there are no real rules. These are not really ironclad rules, but these are the things that I myself stick to. I go by these rules, and in some cases maybe they're non-rules. They're contrary to what's popular. And that's kind of what makes them rules, because you go against what's popular, it becomes sort of a de facto rule. I don't know. Let us just move on here now, and we will get to the top 10 rules for writing by Johnnie Torch. Number 10. Number 10. The journey is always more important than the destination. That's very important. It seems popular today, but you don't need to follow a hero's life from birth to death. Leave equal parts mystery of the past and speculations of a future. For example, it seems a popular thing now, like with, for instance, Man of Steel. The movie starts with Kal-El's birth. And the first Star Trek reboot, I forget what year that came out, around the same time, and we started the movie at Captain Kirk's birth. You really don't need to go back that far. It's good to have characters, I find, that have an air of mystery about them. There is something about their past that we don't fully know, and we just get glimpses of it from time to time. That's kind of the way it is with Bullets Bourbon. I don't really flesh out too much of his backstory. I think it keeps him more mysterious. I think that was something that was done, at least originally, with Indiana Jones. There was sort of the sense that he's been on many, many adventures. He's seen many, many strange things. And it's really, you know, a good thing to give the audience, really. It's something good to give the reader, where they can fill in some of those blanks. And we'll talk about that more later. But, again, another problem is the completion of that. In this day and age, it seems we need to see the character's full life. We have to have the characters die at some point. And you can see that from the Disney Star Wars films, where they're routinely killing off all the original trilogy characters. You can see that in going as far back as Generations with Captain Kirk. It was sort of like we had to signal the end of the classic Trek, and in that passing of the torch, we had to see Captain Kirk die. I would have been happy not seeing Kirk die. I didn't need to see Kirk die to have the torch be passed, because obviously at some point, you know, the hero can sort of ride off into the sunset, which was something, of course, Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade did very well by making that quite literal. That's why I would really resent if they brought back Indiana Jones for at this point would be a 5th movie, and with the sole purpose of we have to kill him off. We have to see the ending of his story. You don't have to see the ending of the story, because, quite honestly, the ending of the story is boring. The ending of the story is mortality, old age, and death. That's not something we really want to see with our heroes. I think that particularly true in the case of the superhero genre, where, you know, we had to see Logan die. We had to see Charles Xavier die. We had to see Iron Man die. We had to see Black Widow die. I don't really feel the need to see my heroes die. It's something that reminds me of, I think Frank Miller said best, where the characters, particularly in the comics, they're like the new mythology. And you don't really want to see your gods die. These are the, you know, the new myths, the new gods on Mount Olympus. And they're larger than life. They really don't need to be given an exit like us poor schmucks who shuffle off our mortal coil. It's something that you don't need to do, and I think, you know, again, there's a reason why the fairy tales always ended with, and they lived happily ever after. This is something they denied, particularly Iron Man, where for all the heroes, you know, trials and travails and all the difficulty that he's gone through, there used to be at least the concept of the reward. The hero was rewarded for his blood, sweat, and tears, the patience, the temptations. They would be rewarded for this. And again, you know, if you have your hero die early or relatively early in their lives, it's denying them that happy ending. It's denying them, and it's also, like I said, it's if you let your heroes live off till old age, it's kind of an inane, you know, unnecessary thing to see your hero have to go the way of all mortal flesh. That's the way I feel about it. And that is rule number 10 in the top 10 Johnnie Torch rules for writing. Number 9. Don't be afraid to camp it up now and then. Now, this is something that I think is important. I think humor is really important. And I think a lot of times, particularly in the comic book films, but I think in pretty much any kind of writing, you'll come across people who don't want humor added, as they think that kind of like dilutes the message or negates the message. I don't think that's necessarily the case. I think you have to have a well-rounded story at all times. I think you need to have the light as well as the dark. You need the shadows for contrast, and it should be a full-formed, you know, a well-orbed plot or treatment that you're trying to do that is encompassing all the emotions. When I see a movie or read a book, I want to feel joy. I want to feel the sadness of a character. I want to feel fear when something suspenseful happens. And that's kind of the object, I think, of the writer, is to try to instill these kinds of various shades and not necessarily have to make everything totally black or totally white. It's interesting to be able to play with different moods. Sometimes in one piece, sometimes it could be over the course of a series. Like, for instance, in my Bullets Bourbon stories, some of them will be varied in my approach to the material. Sometimes I'm trying to do a story that's very funny, and I'm going for a funny tone. I'm going for very light humor. Other times I'm trying to deal with something somewhat serious. And, you know, and in both cases, you have to have a little of both. You need to have some of the light moments for the darker tales to resonate, and you need some, you know, sobering moments to show that we're still in jeopardy and that it's not, you know, just a camp farce. There's nothing wrong with getting a little zany and over the top, so long as you have an emotional core in your story to return to. I would reference Raimi's Spider-Man films. Raimi was very good at that during the Spider-Man films, where he could get very lighthearted and campy at times, while there was still an emotional core of the story. Look at particularly Spider-Man 2, not my favorite, but a lot of people's favorite superhero movie. And it's, at the core of it, it's a very genuine love story with Peter and Mary Jane. There is a lot of emotional elements with Octavius and how he has to sort of learn to let go of what his dream was. There's a lot of emotional core to that story, but then when you watch it, there's practically a joke a minute, really. I mean, there's a lot of really funny and campy scenes. Spidey in the elevator, Peter trying to get his powers back and jumping off the roof. I mean, there's a lot of... it's a good blend, in other words. It's a good blend. The raindrops montage. It's a good blend of having the, you know, having the foresight to take the time to have a lighthearted moment when you have a pretty heavy core to the story. And I think you should keep that in mind and balance how you approach it. And always make sure that it's in balance. I think that's probably the best thing. All right, we'll move on now to number 8 in Johnnie Torch's top 10 writing rules. Number 8, reach the biggest audience. You don't need vulgarity, profanity, extreme violence, nudity, and the like to tell a good story. If you can't show your book to a 6-year-old or 83-year-old granny, you're limiting your audience. Now again, this is a practical lesson that I think a lot of, especially movies, know, because, you know, if you make something rated R, you're very much limiting the income that you would receive had you made it PG or PG-13 so that, you know, families could see it. But also, there is nothing in the vulgarity, profanity, violence, and nudity that makes a story better. When you think of classic Hollywood films, all the films from the 60s, the mid-60s back, were pretty much films that you could show your kids to varying degrees, but there was nothing completely objectionable in them. You know, a 6-year-old is probably going to be bored by Citizen Kane or something, but the fact is you could still show it to them and not feel that there was any negative repercussions from it. And I think that's very true. I think you don't want to segregate your audience. You don't want to say this is not for the kids. You want to be able to reach the largest audience. You don't want to have to segregate, like I said, maybe the elderly people that are less inclined to be interested in something with gratuitous gore and nudity. You can paint a picture just as well without, you know, tipping your hand, without showing everything. Sometimes the monster unseen is more scary than the monster seen with all the blood and guts. And again, you're helping your case. You're helping your story by trying to, you know, keep all eyes on it. You're not going to be as successful if you don't have it as available as it could be if you just, you know, toned back on a couple of inferences. And like I said, it doesn't really make a story better. A story was never made better because of curse words. A story was never made better by nudity. A story was never made better by gore and graphic gore and violence. A lot of things can be implied without being shown. I think particularly this is the way I want to, you know, do my stories. This is the way I do my books, is that I want all people to be able to get something from them. I want all people to see them. It really dumbs down your audience, I think, and it dumbs down yourself as an artist if you are trying to go for sort of that visceral feeling. You know, anybody can be made squeamish by something very gross. You're not really reaching your audience with emotion. What you're doing is you're titillating them on the one hand, or you're you know, repulsing them on the other hand. You're not necessarily creating art, in other words. And I think that's kind of also the point, is you want to make your project as artistic as possible. The idea is not to sort of, you know, push buttons. You're trying to say something, allegedly, and, you know, it depends. How do you want to make your point? With a sledgehammer, when more often than not, you know, maybe a scalpel would do. So that's something to keep in mind. And that is number 8 in Johnnie Torch's top 10 rules for writing. Number 7, this kind of carries on with the previous one, or the previous 2. Imply. You don't need to bash your reader over the head. Trust they're smart enough to make what they will of something and leave it at that. Leaving things open to interpretation isn't always a bad thing. Now, there's a lot of cases where I think a writer wants to be overly verbose and overly explanatory. And that's when you get top-heavy exposition. You don't have to necessarily describe why something is red. You don't necessarily have to describe how a machine works unless it's, you know, part and parcel to the story. It's best that you let the reader imply what they want from it, to get what they want from it. And there's a lot of things you can do. I remember, for instance, In Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan, they never explain why Khan wears a glove on his right hand through the entire picture. That is just left open to the viewer's imagination. Why was that? It's not a plot point. It never comes up. But it allows the reader, or the viewer in that case, to make of it what they will. And I think that's a good thing. I think too many times we try to bash the reader over the head, or the viewer, by saying 5 or 6 times, this is what this is. This is what the object is. This is what the plot is. This is what the story is. You can lay that foundation and then leave it alone. You don't want to bash the reader or the viewer over the head by saying, this is, something several times. And I think it's also important, like I said, to try to keep a vagueness to some certain things, where maybe the viewer or the reader will come to their own conclusion. Maybe that'll be the wrong conclusion, but you're allowing them to invest themselves in the story. You're allowing them to make up their own mind. And then later on they could find out, gee, this went a different way than I thought it was going to go. And then, and then there's some surprise layered into that, which again is usually a good thing. It could be, it depends on how it's set up. I'm not a big fan of subverting expectations. I'm not talking about that so much as you allow the reader to sort of get engrossed in, as we said before, maybe a backstory that is not there, but they can kind of try to figure something out themselves. All right, so that is number 7 in the Johnnie Torch rules for writing. All right, number 6, be timeless. This is kind of important. Unless it's a period piece, refrain from too many topical references. That reference to a pop song or a popular celebrity is going to date your story in less than 5 to 10 years and make it seem old. So, if it's a period piece, it's understandable. You want to be able to, if it's from the 30s, you want to talk about what's going on in the 30s, the fashion, the movies, the stars. That kind of is laying the texture of the time period. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about more like, for instance, like in the Iron Man film, when Tony Stark says, I don't want to see this photo on your MySpace page. Obviously, everyone that sees that now is going to be reminded of just how dated that reference is. That MySpace went down not long after that movie came out. And that's kind of a minor example. I don't think that sinks the movie in any, capacity, but it's important to try to keep your work timeless. If you want to throw in like a political joke at the expense of a candidate or something like that, you're really gonna put an expiration date on your piece. I remember that before when I was writing my books as a kid, and I had some kind of throwaway joke about Clinton, and it's like that kind of dates your book, or it shows that you got some long-term memory over a character or something. And so I immediately deleted it from the work, because that kind of thing is what's going to date your work. You want to make a joke at Trump's expense. That's not going to really be relevant in 5 years. It's going to make your book or your work, whatever it is, look like a period piece in and of itself in a short amount of time. So I would say be timeless. I would refrain from doing any kind of political jokes. I would refrain from talking about the most popular, if you reference the Macarena 15 years ago or whatever it is, obviously you're going to look very behind the times if somebody reads it today. Things like that. And unless, of course, like I said, it's part of the period that you're trying to evoke. All right, let's go. Number 5. Number 5, be escapist. Now, this is possibly the most important. Now, these are not in any particular order. I'm just giving these as randomly as possible. But People generally want to be entertained by fiction and don't desire a political or a social conscious diatribe. If you're going into your story with an agenda, forget it. Nobody wants to be lectured. This is very important. Now remember, this is one of the core tenets of Comicsgate. The idea is that it's sad because in many cases, what people really need is to be lectured in their lives. But you have to remember what the most common emotion of all is not wanting to be lectured. You don't want to be lectured. I don't want to be lectured. Nobody wants to be lectured. So when you're making comics, particularly in this day and age, that's a rule that's forgotten, that people want to be entertained. They want to be entertained first and foremost. This doesn't necessarily mean that you can't have an underlying message. Again, I'm trying to think of examples in film, like, for instance, Star Trek IV, The Voyage Home. Obviously, the message in that film is save the whales. Don't kill whales needlessly and mindlessly and cause the species to become extinct. And the ramifications for that turn out to be devastating in the future. But that wasn't really delivered too heavy-handedly. I think there's only one scene in the film where they show like whaling and to get you, evoke images of how terrible the practice is. But apart from that, it's a pretty lighthearted movie. It's probably the lightest of the Trek films. So, I mean, that's kind of the idea. If you want to have a message, you cannot beat people over the head with how bad they are. You can't go telling people that they're terrible. And you kind of always want to be somewhat neutral in your describing things. I don't think people will get angry too much if you do a balanced piece. If you're talking about guns or something, and everybody in the piece that you're working on wants gun control. Well, obviously, it's going to be very one-sided, and it's not balanced enough that it's going to fly. It's not going to work for everyone. It's going to rub somebody the wrong way. So if you're going to take on some kind of a topic like that, it's always best to have multiple points of view, so it doesn't feel like the writer is bashing you over the head with trying to push an agenda of whatever it is. Especially also in the case of like religion. I don't shy away from writing about religion in my stories. But again, it's not meant to be a diatribe of, you're never going to see Bullets Bourbon versus the Watchtower. Bullets takes on Jehovah's Witnesses. It's not anything like that. It's just basically speaking about God, speaking about Jesus. There is nothing to be afraid of to broach religious topics like that. Some of the best comics have done that. I mean, we've had characters like Daredevil and Nightcrawler where they have religion be a part of their background and their core being, and they deal with those things, those issues. And so that's not necessarily a bad thing. I don't think people should shy away from that. You have various factions of Comicsgate now are kind of afraid to take on those kind of discussions, but that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about not preaching. There's a difference between showing a life well lived, so to speak, than there is trying to turn it into a proselytizing lesson. And that's, I think, the difference. But again, I don't want to minimize having some kind of message in your stories, but the point is you cannot be completely, academic about it. The entertainment is what people came to the story for. They want to be entertained. They want to see the action, the excitement, the romance, whatever it is. They don't want to be lectured. They don't want to feel like they're being talked down to. And again, that's a core tenet of Comicsgate, and not something that comics at this point in time particularly adhere well enough to. Alright, so moving on, once again, we go to number 4, Johnnie Torch's rules to writing. It can be black and white. What does that mean? It can be black and white. We kind of mentioned this before, but The trend seems to be that villains must have noble but misguided intentions. But the best villains also come from selfish ambition. You don't always need to identify with the villain. Now, this is a problem I see more and more often in this day and age. And it started because a lot of people sort of took to the concept of the villain is the hero in his own story. Now, the problem with that is not every villain is a compelling villain in that manner. I think there's a couple. There's Magneto, for instance, who obviously thinks he's doing the right thing. He's been through, a terrible experience in his life, several, and he wants to make the world a better place for his people, but he's doing it the wrong way. Of course, the classic Malcolm X versus Martin Luther King Jr. With Xavier taking the MLK Jr. role. But it doesn't necessarily always have to be that way. I think a lot of times too many, in this day and age, too many writers or aspiring writers, they want to make the villains so sympathetic as to feel for them that you're actually rooting for them. I don't think that's smart or appropriate, really. For example, Eric Killmonger in the Black Panther, you've had a lot of people sympathizing with him to the point of pretty much supporting him. But you forget that he's really espousing genocide. He's really espousing civil war. And even though he's a cool character and all, and he's, only lays out his plans in like maybe one line of dialogue and the rest of it is kind of vague, he is evil. And you don't want to identify with the villain so much that you begin to, support him subconsciously or unsubconsciously. And that's why I've always preferred villains like Emperor Palpatine, where he is unabashedly evil. He's doing what he's doing basically as a power grab. He's not giving any pretense that, what he's doing is for the greater good. The closest thing that you might find to a line that might support that is when in Revenge of the Sith he tells Anakin, or the newly dubbed Darth Vader, at last we will have peace. And the idea is that, in his mind, by his taking over the galaxy and ruling it with an iron grip, there will be no more conflict, there will be no more, challenges to power, because he will be ensconced in the seat of power. And it's less about him thinking he's doing the right thing than trying to make a statement that, well, yeah, I'm going to have everything locked down. There's not going to be any challenge to my rule, and so there'll be peace. Of course, that doesn't even end up being the case in Star Wars, because the rebellion obviously takes issue with the way the Emperor is ruling the galaxy. But the overall message is, yes, sometimes a bad guy is just a bad guy. A black hat is just a black hat. You don't have to make up a sob story for each villain. You don't have to have each villain have a redeeming quality. And again, I don't want to stress that you don't want any villain to have a shade of gray or maybe a good streak, or having something positive in their character. But the point is not every villain has to be sympathetic, has to have lofty ideals. Some of them can, and if they do, they're few and far between. Most of them can't carry it off as well. But, it is no shame to just have a completely black-hatted villain. And I find that to be the most entertaining villain, to be totally honest with you. A villain that knows that his motives are less than pure and yet wants to carry them out anyway. I mean, Shakespeare's tragedies, at least, were replete with those kinds of characters. Alright, so, moving on to number 3 now. Number 3, there is the flip side of that. Heroes don't need to be flawed. I'm not saying a hero can't be complex, but a hero should be admired. If he possesses too many negative traits, he's an anti-hero and shouldn't be passed off as anything more than. Now, again, this is a little bit of a difficult one to also, a lot of people want to put, for instance, the anti-hero in the place of the hero. They don't care that Batman kills. For example, if Batman kills, he's only doing the right thing because he's protecting innocent people. But you have to remember that that makes him a vigilante. That makes him not an agent of good, but an agent of destruction, because killing is ultimately destruction. And when you put too much of that negativity on your character, on your heroic character, once again, you're identifying with a character that is not morally upright. You're identifying with a morally neutral character the same way as you would be identifying with a villain who is morally neutral and just betraying, more dark tendencies to get what they want. In the same case here, a hero, does the right thing. You have to admire the hero. You have to admire the way he goes about things. Now, again, this doesn't mean the hero can't be complex, doesn't mean he can't be conflicted. But again, a character like Superman, for instance, he is not a conflicted character. He knows what's right and does the right thing. There may be conflict because sometimes doing the right thing is painful and you can't save everybody. But the fact is that he has a code of conduct, same as Batman is supposed to have, at least in the comics, and that he will not break that code of conduct. And it's very important to establish that he's the good guy. Like, for instance, the Punisher is an anti-hero. He is not a hero. I would not say he's a villain, because he does what he does for allegedly the right reasons. But he is taking upon himself the character of the law and is not giving law its due process. He's not giving law its course. It's not, it's not the easy thing to not take a life. That's the easy way, to take a life. And you end it right there. But having your characters, your heroic characters, have a sense of obligation to the law and just simple morality, it's an important part, I think. I think it's important to stay, morally upright with your hero characters and not give them too many dark traits of just not being afraid to mass murder if necessary. That's not the heroic way. All right, so moving on to number 2, as we're getting closer and closer now to number 1 of Johnnie Torch's rules for writing. Number 2, don't fear the damsel. There's a reason the damsel in distress motif has lasted. Heroes, by definition, save people, typically a loved one. Having the hero's boy or girlfriend in danger is powerful and relatable. Now, this goes to the PC crowd, once again encroaching on this time-old trope where, Lois Lane was only ever as significant to the story as long as she was getting in danger, and Superman had to save her. And again, this is not really a sexist trope. You would have the same thing going on with Wonder Woman. Steve Trevor would get in trouble, and who would come to save him? Wonder Woman. It's not really the gender of the character that matters. What matters is that a loved one is put in danger. And a lot of times, because we have, the PC crowd, the SJWs, and the concept of, fridging the girlfriend or whatever, people are afraid, I think, in stories to put the loved one at risk, to have the girlfriend kidnapped or the boyfriend in some cases. But that is very human and very relatable. It's a powerful thing because everybody knows, everyone has a loved one, and they know what they would feel like had that loved one been put in danger, had that loved one been put in jeopardy. So you don't want to really poo-poo the idea of putting the hero's girlfriend or the heroine's boyfriend or a family member, an Aunt May character or something. You don't want to necessarily just completely poo-poo the concept and say, oh, I can't do that. That's sort of an old-fashioned trope. Well, it's old-fashioned for a reason. It's gone back to antiquity, I suppose. But, it's something that works is the reason why. It's relatable, and all people can understand the emotion that the hero's going through in order to save someone that is important to them. It's instantly relatable, and it makes you care more about the dilemma. And so again, like I said, it's not something that's ultimately necessary for a story, but I don't think you should shy away from it and feel like, that it's sort of a passé concept. All right, and here we are with the number one rule for writing, according to Johnnie Torch. Number 1, plan ahead. Plan ahead. Plant seeds in stories to keep readers guessing what or when an event can come to fruition. You can keep them vague should you choose to go another way, but get readers invested in the future. All right, so the idea is, when you're writing a story, it's always cool to just lay some seeds, lay some groundwork, get the next story ready before the first story is already done. I've done this in many ways with my characters for Bullets Bourbon. For example, we mention Veronica in the first issue. And, as of this recording, the next book will feature Veronica. It's a slow lead up to this character's introduction. She's mentioned in the first issue, and then she's mentioned in the 4th and 6th issues. So again, the mentioning of a character makes people interested. When is this character going to show up? Is this character ever going to show up? Is this character always going to be just mentioned? And again, this is kind of like leading the reader to, invest in the story, invest their interest in where the storyline is going to go, particularly if it's a serialized story, of course. In the same way, Carrot Top mentions his father in the first issue, and I think in the 5th issue, and again now we're going to introduce Carrot Top's father in the 7th issue. So again, you get the reader interested. Why does Carrot Top keep mentioning his father? Why is he bringing up his father? What's his father got to do with this? And eventually, when that character is revealed, you've got the reader already invested. So when the story, when you start advertising for the next story, you say, oh, we're finally going to meet Carrot Top's father, you get the reader's interest already from having an investment in, wow, I know something about this. There's something important about this character that I'm going to find out in the next issue, and it leads more interest into the future issues. It's always interesting, and it's always important to keep the reader interested in what's coming next. I think you should always lay some groundwork for what's coming next, even if it's in a small way. There's a couple of instances in the 1st and 2nd issues where I've mentioned things that probably went totally over readers' heads, that they probably don't know it means anything, and it's just a throwaway line to them. And that's good. But later, when they actually see, oh, yeah, that was something that he said back then, gee, I didn't know that was going to turn into something. But they look back on it and they say, wow, yeah, it was already, planned for, it was already thought of, and it's not just something that was thrown in at the last moment. Of course, like I said, you can keep some of these groundwork things relatively vague. If you're not sure what direction you want to go in with a character or with a storyline, you can always keep it relatively vague. I think that kind of is what happened with the death of Gwen Stacy in the comics, where a nameless, shadowy figure witnessed the death of Green Goblin, and they really didn't pick up on that right away. And I think at the time they really didn't know what they were going to do with that, and I think they eventually, let it be Harry Osborn, I think. But that's kind of the thing. If you want to leave it vague, and then just leave yourself an out. Another thing that reminds me of that is also like maybe Wrath of Khan, where Nicholas Meyer, they just had Spock, place his hands on McCoy's face and say remember, and that was just basically the out. That was the out for another movie. That was the out for another storyline. And I think that's really important. You have to leave yourself an out in a lot of cases for where the story's going to go next. If you kill off your villain and you want to bring him back, you have to think of a way where that's feasible. At least in my case, when I've allegedly killed off Carrot Top and Pencil Neck, I already had in mind how they were going to survive. I think that's a cop-out if you don't explain to the audience how a villain survived. And that's kind of another thing you have to do. You can't just have the big explosion happen, then later on when you realize you want to use your villain again, well, how was he not blown to smithereens? Well, you have to think of that when you're doing the original story where he's blown to smithereens. Otherwise, it's going to feel like a cop-out that, well, oh, yeah, so they really stretched a point here to bring back so-and-so. That's why forethought is so important. It's so important to plan ahead, especially for things like that, with mysteries, with characters coming back from the supposed dead. It's very important. All right, so there you have it. There are our top 10 rules, and we have a +1, one for good luck. I'm going to give you one. I'll leave you one. And the +1 is, I think it's always important to be positive. I don't believe in having my comics be a downer. You want to be escapist. You want the reader to have fun and forget about their problems for a half hour or whatever. Doesn't mean you can't have a downbeat ending. For instance, Empire Strikes Back is one of the best films ever made, and the good guys lose. But even there, you have to leave the reader with hope. The story isn't over. We had fun getting here, and we'll have to do better next time. That's very important because you don't want the story to be a downer. You know, people come to entertainment for different reasons. They want to laugh, they want to get scared, they want to, you know, maybe shed a tear or two with a poignant story, but they want to feel entertained. They want to feel that their time invested was worth something. They want to feel that they're uplifted morally from what they've seen, whether it was a comedy or a tragedy. I think your boy Zach said it best, and I might be paraphrasing him, but I remember him saying in one of his videos, and he said it a couple of times, but a good story should leave you with a good, clean, positive feeling afterwards. So try to inspire, not bring down. A lot of times when I'm inspired to write, it's because I've seen some of the best storytelling, whether it's in a movie or in a book or something. You see a good story, it inspires you. And I would like to have people leave my stories feeling inspired, like, that's a good story. I want to be able to write something that makes me feel the way I felt after seeing that. And again, it doesn't necessarily mean it has to be a happy story. It could have a downbeat ending. It doesn't necessarily mean it has to be all cheerful and sunny at the end of it. But you have to leave the reader with hope, knowing that if it was a down chapter, then there'll be a good chapter afterwards. There'll be a happy ending. There'll be a resolution that makes everybody happier, or at least, you know, as far as the main protagonist goes, to make them happy. It's very important, I think, and I think that's what's really, you know, morally uplifting stories. That's what you need to really focus on. You don't want to, you know, there's enough degeneracy and stuff in the real world. There's sometimes the most satisfying thing is just seeing the good guys win. You know, seeing the bad guys get theirs. You know, seeing someone, you know, falling in love. You know, it could be anything, but as long as it's something morally uplifting, something that you feel that it's inspired you to think more positively, I think that's an important thing, and I think that's something that readers should more strive for, and writers should more strive for, is something that's very positive, something that should get you, you know, in a good frame of mind, as I said, with a good, clean, positive feeling afterwards, that you've experienced something good and morally uplifting. And not often enough do we get that in fiction, I don't think, these days. Probably still happens from time to time. I can't think of too many in recent years. But, so that's it. That's my +1. I hope you enjoyed the video. Give it a thumbs up if you have. Make sure you share and subscribe if you haven't. We do a show here every Saturday, the only way to spend your Saturday, here with Johnnie Torch Live, where we talk about the pop culture goings-on, so check that out if you haven't. I also do periodic reviews of different superhero and sci-fi related content, so you may enjoy that as well. Thank you for joining us yet again. As you may or may not well know, this is your host, Johnnie Torch, reminding you once again, keep the flame burning brightly, and I'll be with you again real soon.